Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Gains for Girls podcast. As always, I am very grateful and glad that you are here, tuned in, listening. I say it every single episode, but I want you to do it. Go to OutKick.com. That is where you will find all things Gains for Girls. You can like and you can subscribe. You can share these episodes far and wide, which is super helpful. And you're going to want to do that today because I have the honor of speaking with someone who knows what it means to serve. Not just in uniform, of course, but in the fight for the future of our country. Will Thibeau, he is a former Army Ranger, a role that demands the highest level of discipline, of courage, and of leadership. But his service did not end when he took off the uniform. Now he's channeling that same warrior mindset into a new mission, which is defending the principles that make America strong and standing up for what is right in the policy and cultural battles that we face today. So very excited for this. We are going to dive into his military experience, how that shaped his approach to leadership, what he sees as the biggest challenges facing our country. Of course, his take on the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and how he is handling the job. So let's get right into it with Will Thibeau. Well, Will, welcome to the Gains for Girls podcast. I am so excited for this conversation. And before anything, I just want to thank you for your service, for your leadership, for your bravery, for everything that you have done and certainly continue to do. So very, very grateful. Look, I kind of just want to hop right into it. We have seen some pretty major changes over these past, 7, almost 8 weeks now, with President Donald Trump back in the White House, with Pete Hegseth back in charge of defense and military. So can you just kind of walk us through maybe the comparison to under the Biden administration to our military under President Trump with Pete Hegseth's leadership?
Of course. And I want to start, though, by saying this has been a problem in the military for a lot longer than me, you, or a lot of your listeners probably think. In 1965, you saw the first race quotas in the U.S. military. Secretary of Defense McNamara at the time wanted the military to be the epicenter for victory for the civil rights movement, meaning that there's a mandate that the military look racially and eventually by sex like the nation, or we could presume injustice. And this continued for decades. It took on, as you probably know, new steam during the Obama administration, intense scrutiny for military officers, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to make the military more conducive to U.S. social policy, allowing women into combat roles unrestricted. And then, as you know, Riley, the Biden administration, I think just took the mask off of any pretense that the military was an apolitical institution and ensured that the nation and the people believed it to be an institution of the left. And so you saw force-wide mandates for diversity. And again, this is not an encouragement for tolerance or anti-discrimination, but a mandate that units at every level, small to big, looked a certain way based on the color of soldiers' skin or their sex. That's, it's frankly, it's policies that even Harvard and Yale didn't have on the books. Transvestite service members were allowed to serve not just openly, but as a matter of pride as military policy. They celebrated Pride Month every year. It was clear who belonged and who didn't in the Biden military. And, you get a sense, to your point, that the first 2 months of the Trump administration are a sign that President Trump and Secretary Hegseth know that if not now, we never will have the chance to reclaim the institution of the military, first for political neutrality, but even for conservatives in America. We won't ever be able to reclaim it again as a place that, your kids or my kids could serve honorably and faithfully. And you get a sense that this is the time. And it starts with restoring standards as a means of determining who's best, not just a basic pass-fail benchmark for place in a unit.
Let's go back to those race quotas. You said 1965?
Yeah, it started with the Defense Race Relations Board, which again was, the thought that the Pentagon could be the first institution that embraced the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it's been a while.
Wow. I definitely had no idea. I would imagine many Americans are in the same boat as me, having no idea. Of course, we saw, as you said, right, the past 4 years, but to understand this has been going on so much longer than that, maybe behind closed doors, whatever it was, I think really brought to light in the previous 4 years. That is eye-opening. And we've seen, of course, I think your everyday American can understand how these DEI programs and initiatives impact military readiness and operational effectiveness. But I want to ask you about these military leaders. Like, are they feeling pressured to abide by these ideological viewpoints rather than focusing on military excellence or merit, I guess, in which is in contrast to everything that DEI stands for?
I think that's undeniable. And to your great observation that this has been going on under the radar for a lot longer than we think. It's due to the genuine and I think worthy deference that the American people have to the military as an institution because of the very unique job that the military as a whole and the individuals in the military have to do on behalf of the nation. But what I think is important, what I think is changing is the understanding that uniformed military leaders are culpable for this ideological takeover that took place over the last 50 or 60 years. It is one thing, uniformed military leaders have to follow the orders of the political appointees in the Department of Defense, obviously the Secretary of Defense and the President foremost amongst them. But what doesn't have to happen, a uniformed admiral doesn't have to speak at a Women's Equality Day event and say that military officers should be skeptical of laws passed by Congress because so many elected representatives are white men. An Army general doesn't have to say that soldiers are complicit in white supremacy if they serve at Fort Benning or Fort Bragg based on the names of those institutions. What I think we saw during the Biden administration especially was this really brazen political embrace of an ideology over the professional duty of the uniformed military to follow orders. And that's objectionable. That's against military law. To embrace ideology and politics in uniform. But to your point, it really did fracture the relationship and the trust between the public and the military who's sworn to defend them.
And we saw that in recruiting numbers and different things, right? I think, if I'm not mistaken, when President Biden left office, or let's say at the end of 2024, I know specifically in the Army, those are some of the numbers I saw. It was like the lowest recruiting levels maybe in years and in history. I can't remember exactly the timeline there. But then again, following Secretary Hegseth's appointment, it was like the highest recruiting numbers in many years. So, can you speak to that? Like, is there this newfound sense of pride in our military? And I think even more broadly, to be an American, I think we lost that. I will speak as someone who obviously doesn't have the military background or expertise that you do. But I can say personally, I feel much more prideful and patriotic in saying that I am American now than I did under Joe Biden's leadership.
Well, you get it. And that's a worthy sentiment that I think reflects, reality for those who are considering service in the military. But what I think is the underlying point, and, frankly, as someone who deployed multiple times to Iraq, it's something to which I can relate. The American people trust their leaders in this administration. The American Principles Project, an organization I know with which you're familiar, they did a study and it showed the biggest reason why veterans didn't want their children to serve, and that's a huge percentage of the military. The biggest reason they didn't want them to serve is because of a mistrust of military leaders, and wokeness is a cause. I don't want my son serving on an aircraft carrier if he has to go by a pride parade every other day in June. But also, even as important, I want my sons to serve in a military that will consider their sacrifice and their service responsibly. I don't want them to serve in forever wars. I don't want them, to serve in interests that are not directly related to the American people. And that's what I think President Trump and Secretary Hegseth represent: a confidence that the military, if it must be used, will be used on behalf of the American people and our homeland. And it's something that has been lost for decades. And again, I say that as someone who fought in Iraq for a cause that I think about questioning a lot.
I made the mistake of not asking you. I mean, the first question I should have asked you is to explain your background in the military. You mentioned your deployments. Talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a humble background compared to most. I was an Army infantry officer. I was blessed enough to serve in what I think is the greatest military unit, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and it was as a Ranger that I deployed multiple times to the Middle East. But it was for uncertain causes. I deployed over 10 years after we started the war in Iraq, and I remember stepping foot on the tarmac my first deployment and wondering, thinking back to my younger self, contemplating the invasion in 2003 and just wondering how it was still the case that, American soldiers were deploying to the country. But at the end of the day, a lot of people, talk this way or that way about joining the military, but it would, I think it'll always be the best job I ever had. And I loved every minute. That's
right. I've got to ask you, of course, about the horrific, destructive, disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal. I have had the greatest honor of getting to know several of these Gold Star family members, whether it's moms or siblings or aunts. And I mean, my heart breaks, of course, for the situation that they have found themselves in. But to see their resilience, I guess, and just understanding, even still with their children, their nephews, their siblings being gone, that it was the ultimate sacrifice that they signed up for, of course, in a way that is unfathomable to most. I want to get your thoughts just on the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah, and thanks so much for your support of Gold Star Families Rally. It's a tragedy and it's a disaster. You wonder so much of all the things that could have been done differently. Frankly, especially at the senior military officer level, right? The commander of Central Command, General Mark Milley. Why you can ask yourself a lot of reasons, from the location of the withdrawal to the timing of why certain things had to happen the way they do. But I'll say this, as someone who is, very close. I never went to Afghanistan myself. My wife did. Countless friends did. I lost friends in Afghanistan. What it says to me is that we spent more than 20 years of blood, sweat, and treasure in that country, building up their government, building up the military, and it collapsed. It all collapsed over the course of a long weekend. And this is after, every 6 months or so, a 4-star general would testify in Congress that U.S. forces only needed a few more bodies and a few more $1 billion, and we can turn the tide and make the government of Afghanistan a responsible American-like democracy. But for some reason, after all that investment, it all just collapsed. And although I do think there should be some accountability and some scrutiny to how the withdrawal happened, I want accountability for how we went 20 years with such little to show for it. That's the tragedy. That's the crime. My heart aches for the Gold Star families of those 13 Marines and the soldier who were killed. But I'm also thinking about all the Gold Star families of the almost 4,000 guys and girls that we lost in the 20 years prior. That's the tragedy. Frankly, I think that might even be a crime that the Trump administration should ask a lot of questions about.
That's right. And I don't think that's a number that's talked about often. I certainly haven't heard that 4,000 number. So I'm in full agreement with you. You mentioned, obviously, I mean, you dedicate really your time now to really combating the wokeness in the military. You mentioned these different standards that men and women have, different expectations, different, whether it's fitness tests, fitness levels, whatever it is. Can you speak to those a little bit? Because of course, my platform and the people who listen to this podcast, it's built around the idea that, of course, men and women are different, right? I mean, the novel concept, the very controversial statement that men and women are different. So can you talk about what this looks like in regards to the military?
Well, yeah, and I think the military is still coming to grip with that reality. And let's just play a little bit of history. We don't have to go all the way back to 1965, but in 2014, President Obama removed the combat exclusion policy, which was the policy in the military that there are certain jobs or military occupation specialties that are not open or available for women, infantry amongst them. There are a few others. This was done under the belief that we should not discriminate against any man or woman who could pass the same standards in order to serve in whatever job they want. Now, categorically, I think this gets something very wrong about the military. It's not an institution of equal opportunity. It's an institution of violence and remarkable unit cohesion. But we can perhaps come back to that. But what the Army was doing concurrently to that policy change is the launch of what is still called the Army Combat Fitness Test, which is going to be a test, supposedly, to better measure a soldier's ability to perform in ground combat. You'd lift weights, you'd do pull-ups, you'd drag heavy things, you'd sprint, and you'd run and do some push-ups, a few other events. Again, this was supposed to be a test that would measure men and women on the same scale. More than 10 years later, tens of millions of dollars later, the Army Combat Fitness Test is still gender segregated, right? That we've never reached the panacea that the Army's claimed, to have been true, that men and women should be evaluated on the same standards. And in fact, they've removed events from the Army Combat Fitness Test under political pressure from female generals and senators because there's a discrepancy in how men and women, imagine that, performed on a given test. We're still waiting for this, for this concept of genuine merit-based standards. I think, Secretary Hegseth made an announcement last week that may indicate we're finally getting there. But even if you buy the notion that women should be able to serve in ground combat roles, you should at least acknowledge that we have not gotten to the place where men and women are evaluated on the same playing field. It's this cognitive dissonance between the realities of war that know no sex between, based on who gets wounded, who doesn't, and, who should be in these positions based on their.
Yeah. And you mentioned cohesion. I have several people in my life who were in the military. And when I bring this topic up with them, they say, look, if we had a woman on the combat field with us as a man, our mindset shifts. Our job at that point is to look after the woman, right? Like that's, I think, what any man, at least who was raised right, even innately, inherently, subconsciously, you're looking after someone who should be able to look after themselves and others around them. So I thought that was an interesting point, again, outside of the obvious and very real physical differences between men and women. We've seen several reports over the past few weeks, even as this morning, of swatting taking place, targeting really these MAGA influencers or whatever you want to call them. Kash Patel has said that the FBI is currently investigating this issue. I wanted to ask you, how do you see this type of, I don't know what it is, intimidation mechanism maybe affecting our public safety? And do you have any insight into what could help something like this?
Well, I think this highlights the importance of legitimate federal power, who can not only, again, create a neutral playing field for Democrats and Republicans, the left and the right in America, but who can prosecute and dismantle the networks, because I do think it's a network, and the people who are propagating this. We should go after the people who are pursuing swatting of reasonable Americans under the full extent of the law, just like January 6th protesters, were pursued. We should pursue these people. You and I both know that it's easy in this technological age to understand who makes phone calls from where. The information's out there. You probably barely need a warrant to get there. So I hope the FBI is on it. I imagine they are. But it's just a sign that the left and right don't play by the same rules. I can't think of a time that a leftist was swatted, by a conservative. I hope that those of us who are interested in the truth still speak for it, and we have to. But we have federal power now, and so let's not avoid it. Let's use federal power to preserve our way of life and, the safety of our families.
That's right. Something I'm always intrigued in talking to U.S. military members is what was the process like for you post-military? Do you feel like you received the help and the support? First of all, when were you done?
Yeah, I left the military in 2020, almost 5 years ago to the day.
Do you feel like you received the help and support at that time that I believe, and of course that majority of Americans believe you're entitled to? Actually, legally, that you are entitled to.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I'm kind of the type, Irish heritage or whatever. I'm just going to kind of put my nose down and grind, and I'm not sure what I deserve, but I do think that America's veterans deserve preferential treatment. Even to this day, I only feel at home around my old Army buddies or my former Rangers and guys who kind of have lived through what I lived through. I've been blessed because I have a family and I have people who love me, and that's kind of my saving grace. But what I worry about is the guys who don't. The guys who really saw traumatic events and don't have a venue for fellowship and brotherhood. That's kind of, our atomized society has encroached even to the military. One thing I want to do more research on, the early part of the war on terror, early 2000s, barracks looked more like open bays and with bunk beds for the younger guys. And so when you'd come home from overseas, you were just with everyone. You were with your brothers, with your teammates. More and more, barracks started to look like hotel rooms where every soldier, even the junior ones, just had their own room, their own shower, and there was no impetus for them to get out and be with each other, even after coming home from traumatic experiences. These are the things that I'm hoping, people like Secretary Collins and even, Secretary Hegseth can start to look at. How do we, bring soldiers and veterans together? Because that's the only way I think you can replace and preserve the mental health of guys. It's not about, I just don't think it's about drugs or, experiences. I do think it's about faith and a spiritual life, but you have to show, you have to show guys like me that there are others right here next to you. They're just looking for a shoulder and, a guy who gets it to talk with.
That's right. So what next? Obviously, as we've mentioned, Pete Hegseth, he's issuing these orders of reviewing military grooming and fitness standards and across the board, returning the military to a place where, of course, its job is to make America safe, make America strong. So what are kind of the next big things that you would like to see our current administration look into and improve as it pertains to the military?
Well, it starts with accountability. By my counts, there are over 70 uniformed generals and admirals who openly advocated for DEI as military policy as part of their service. They made it their public persona to support DEI as policy. I think that's objectionable. And I think one way or the other, they should be shown the door and made clear that it's because they supported such actions that they're not going to get promoted or continue service. That's one. The second is, I think the Senate and the House need to step in and codify much of what President Trump and Secretary Hegseth are doing in law. I mean, the Republicans have the majority in both the House and Senate. It's time that we eliminate for the future any use of race or sex as considerations for military personnel and programs. We have to end the days where quotas are possible. What happened in the first Trump administration and even previous Republican administrations is that the kind of ideological current continued undetected. We have to make that impossible for whenever President Trump does lead office. And then third, and it's not final, but for our purposes, I'll pause here. We need to consider organizational reform to the military. Why do our service academies look like 4-year institutions where you can get a major in social studies? West Point, until about 4 weeks ago, offered a diversity and inclusion studies degree, right? It's easy to take something off a website, but we need to consider broader structural reforms so that it can't happen for generations of officers into the future. Same with military organizations like the Joint Staff, right? If there's a deep state in the military it's the Joint Staff, unaccountable to any political official. And they make a joke that you can't plan a barbecue in the military without Joint Staff concurrence. They shouldn't be that influential. Those generals are meant to provide advice and consent to the president, and not much more. So let's make sure that's all they do.
Yeah, all good things. I think the general public, I certainly wouldn't have. Actually, let me be very clear. Had I not been kind of thrusted into the position that I'm in now, I wouldn't know that an executive order is not codified permanently into law for ever and ever and ever. Those can be undone just as quickly as they were instated. So I totally agree. Shifting public persona, encouraging the public to pester their legislators, their lawmakers, their elected officials into making really the America First agenda as a whole permanent is crucial stuff. Last thing for you, I think I just would love to hear your advice for the next generation. Even still, right? I think many young Americans, they just feel disconnected from maybe not even, military service. I think service as a whole, from civic duty. So what advice do you have for those who are looking to lead with purpose? Again, whether that's in the military, public service, advocacy, or beyond.
Well, I'll just say I do encourage military service. I don't, there's all this discussion online and in political circles about how you cultivate masculinity and, the virtues of manhood. And I'm so confused as to why, service in the military is often excluded from that, because it cultivates sacrifice. You subjugate your own desires for the good of others. It cultivates physical fitness, rigor, and immense suffering, again, for a cause greater than yourself. And you can do something of which you are really proud, and that is timeless. It is, to me, it's become a real shame that the military was no longer seen as a place where a conservative American man or a conservative American boy could grow up and become a man. Because that's what it was for me. I wouldn't be anyone without my service in the military. And it's okay to say that, and we should reclaim it, because if your life is just about kind of personal benchmarks of fulfillment and achievement, I think you'll reach the end of your days. And I don't know myself, but I think you'll reach the end of your days and kind of wonder what's been. Even me in my 30s, I can look back with some confidence that I spent my 20s doing something of which I am proud. I'm doing something that I want to show my sons and my kids, my daughters, and hope that they can be proud. And that is, I think, a benchmark of success. If you've done something to which you can pass on, to your children and to your family, it's the measure of a life worth living. And then the task for, I think, you and me now, Riley, is to make sure the nation is worth the sacrifice. But if it's not, then I think we're in bad shape. But until we get there, I think service is a great way to spend your 20s. No doubt.
And you mentioned that brotherhood you have. I was on a team, right? I played sports, and it's, I can imagine, similar to a degree where you would do anything for one another. But in our case, we weren't. That didn't really mean risking our lives. So the brotherhood that I'm sure you've developed over the years will withstand time. That's for sure. So we appreciate you. We appreciate your service, everything that you've done. I really believe that you're a hero for your time on the battlefield, and again, for what you continue to do and highlighting the problems that exist. But not only that, working to create solutions in this reform you speak of. So thank you so much, Will.
Yeah, thank you, Riley. I'm not a hero, but I really appreciate the chance to highlight those who are.
After just talking with Will, I feel like just patriotism is on the rise again. So thank you, Will, to all U.S. military members and their families. Thank you for your service. As always, very grateful that you're here, that you're listening. Again, go to OutKick.com. That is where you will find all things Gains for Girls, and we will see you again next week. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. The fight to save women's sports and restore common sense is far from over, and I continue the conversation every week. So make sure to catch more content over here and subscribe to OutKick so you don't miss a thing.